Have you ever noticed how the moon lurks? It peers from behind the Erd tree and beside the shadow tree. It sits and it watches, its presence as ubiquitous in the lands between as it is in the land of shadows. It looms heavily over us. Have you noticed that the moon watches over the shaman village, morning, day, evening, and even, of course, at night? The entire theory of today's video came from my notice of this fact. Why would the moon have such a presence in the shaman village? The moon, which has close ties to the Carians, to Rani, to Ranala, to R'hllana. Not America, right? Why is the moon so important in Elden Ring? What is its connection to the Numen? Welcome to my channel, everyone. Today I want to take you on a journey deep into my interpretation of the history of House Caria, the ancient astrologers, and the importance of the moon in Elden Ring. Be wary, this is a long path of associations, of vibes, and there will be many pits of missing logic. And this is because FromSoft has not deigned to impart all knowledge to our lowly shriveled husks. So if you please, join me. The black moon of Anoxtella was the guide of countless stars. If the stars hold our fate, and the moon guides those stars, does it not follow that the moon then guides us, the tarnished? We know there are at least two moons in the lands between, the dark moon and the full moon. The same moon is seen looming over the realm of shadows as is seen in the lands between. The same moon, perhaps, that comes close at the altar of moonlight. The moon here is strange, as we can see its dim shadow of another moon still peering from behind the Erd tree, while this bright moon sits at the altar of moonlight. Here, two moons are visible in the sky for the first time. Still, neither of these moons are full or new, but both in perpetual gibbous. What do we know of the moons in Elden Ring? Well, we know the full moon was embraced by Ranala, queen of the full moon. We know that we don't see the full moon in the sky of Elden Ring. We know that the Carian princess R'hllana met these moons with her sister, Queen Ranala. And can we please ask somebody who does the naming conventions to please stop naming sisters and siblings such close names? I get all tongue-tied. Anyways, when the sisters met these moons, they were nestled against one another. The moons, not the sisters. This was a 2-as-1 moon, that same gibbous moon that we see in our sky, half light, half dark. They likely met these moons at the moonlit altar at the temple of Mana Celeste. We know the moon Ranala chose to follow, once again, was that full moon that she met as a child. But we also know that Rani would later meet the cold, dark moon, led by the hand of her mother. So we know that the moons have a special connection to the Carians, and we know that the moons hold sway over the Carian royals, as it is lunar magic that Ranala used to become queen. And we also know that stars command the fate of the Carians, and in the past, stars guided the fate of all. Once upon a time, the stars of the night sky guided fate, and this is a recollection of those times. Who are the Carians? Why does the moon hold such command over them? What is their connection to Numen? How many questions can I ask in a row before I need to start answering them? I will attempt to answer these questions, except for the last one, by delving back as far as I am able with in-game clues and real-life mythology. Once again, this is my personal interpretation, and honestly, I would love to hear yours because sometimes I feel like a crazy person, so other people being crazy about Elden Ring lore would make me so much less alone. Anyways, let's move on. In her youth, Rennala was a prominent champion who charmed the academy with her lunar magic, becoming its master. She also led the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty. From her remembrance, we know Rennala was the one who established the House of Caria as royalty. And from the Stargazer heirloom, we know Rennala is an astrologer. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. So the Carians are astrologers, who seem to be chosen by the moon in some way. Now, we need to explore who the astrologers were and are in the lands between. Astrologers are an ancient group of scholars who, like their name suggests, study the stars. Often referred to as a collective, but were likely several sects containing members from across the lands between. After all, astrologers in the game are a starting class, not a race. It's my belief that astrologers, and therefore Carians, have an interesting tie to the Numen. You see, the Numen arrived in the lands between long ago and brought with them what seems to be the worship of trees. This isn't so linked to astrologers yet, but, and hear me out, I believe the Numen were born of trees cultivated by the first astrologers who were themselves Numen. So why do I believe this? To discover this, let's journey down the River Wells to deep inside the lands between, where the two rivers flow. Here let's view the statue of the Knowledge Bearer, as I will call him. This ever-present statue seems to hold quite the ancient importance to the people who built these ruins, people that I believe were Numen and astrologers, the first astrologers of the lands between. The man in this statue is associated with roots. They extend from his body down to a tablet. Roots are often associated with trees, especially in the lands between. These roots, in my opinion, are to represent that he is associated with Numen, who employed shamanistic practices involving trees and, according to my upcoming theory, were born from trees. Not only this, but the ruins where these statues are found are filled with what seem to be a forest of petrified trees. The link between the Numen and the trees can be seen most clearly in the realm of shadow. In these lands, we can find the grandmother in the shaman village, the village of Numen from which Marika hailed. There in the shaman village, the grandmother tree sits with the petrified visage of a woman within that tree. And as mentioned before, the moon's presence in the shaman village is constant. Also in the realm of shadows is Bonnie Village. This is where the shamans were spirited away from their home in the shaman village, and their malleable bodies were made use of by the Hornsend potentates. Here we find another grandmother tree, but the woman of this tree has been beheaded. Perhaps she was desecrated by the potentates when this secret worship of the grandmother tree was discovered. Both of these villages are evidence of the Numen's connection to trees, and honestly causes speculation as to why Numens are so malleable with them. And it also makes you wonder what the trees of Anir-Elim are made of. But that's not why we're here today. We are here to speak of Numen astrologers, trees, and Carians. The roots of the astrologer Knowledge Bearer not only expresses his link to Numen, but reach down to a discarded tablet which depicts the Babylonian map of the world. I wouldn't have known about this without the Tarnished Archaeologist, so thank you, Tarnished Archaeologist. So these roots, I believe, are representative of the roots of the civilization this man and his people, astrologers, came into contact with. He, or his people, brought a new philosophy, a new way of seeing the world, and thus is shown to be an important figure and a bearer of sacred text. The ancient knowledge at his feet is not completely discarded, but it has been superseded by this new information, this new way to view the world. This belief system, the knowledge bearer and the other Numen astrologers brought to the lands between, changed the lands with the study of the night sky and the powerful beings that lie therein. In the same ruins of the knowledge bearer are these pillars which seem to depict the arrival of vessels, the planting of trees, possibly the birth of a child, and some kind of gathering or ritual. And finally, the last scene seems to be a dynasty headed by what looks to be a woman, but I'm not so sure. I can't really tell. Another similar pillar shows a group holding staves as the top image instead of the vessels. Perhaps these are two depictions of the same event from two perspectives. One of those viewing the arrival and one of those arriving. Perhaps this event is of Numen astrologers arriving to the lands between. Now, the image of the arrival on ships bears a striking resemblance to the giant stone coffins found in the cerulean coast. These coffins seem to have drifted in from the sea and are very ship-like in shape, having a helm and a figurehead at least. And have you checked out the bottom of this thing? It definitely looks like a ship to me. The very center of the lands between. All manners of death washed up here, only to be suppressed. This quote at the Tower of Suppression lets us know that indeed the realm of shadows is a part of the lands between, at least was before America somehow separated it. So, if these ships landed here, that means they also landed in the lands between. The Numen are said to hail from lands outside the lands between. The lands between are an island and would necessitate at least travel by sea, if not some other kind of fantastical travel. It is my belief that the Numen astrologers depicted in the pillars traveled to the lands between on these stone coffin-like vessels. Vessels that contained the flesh of deceased Numen, or perhaps the bodies of their gods, which would later be used to sprout new Numen. So before we can get into all of that and the sprouting of Numen, how are these coffins linked to the knowledge bearer and those ruins? The stone coffins bear the prominent image of a bull, set at the helm and the figurehead of the coffins. This bull, I believe, is an important link to the events that have occurred linking the Numen and astrologers even further. There is a small tombstone in the ancient ruins of the knowledge bearer that depicts a bovine. But this image does not just depict a bovine, it also depicts a circle above the bull which holds 4 what seem to me to be saplings. Now this is where I may go from the deep end into uncharted waters, but I ask you to please bear with me. The ancient ruins of the underground rivers have many connections to the area of Mesopotamia of our own history. There's the very obvious 2 rivers, the tablet at the feet of the knowledge bearer which depicts the Babylonian map of the world, and the pillars that I've already mentioned, which are based on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III from Nimrud of northern Iraq. Because of these connections, I believe it stands to reason that depictions of the bull on the tombstones may be related to myths in the area of ancient Mesopotamia and other nearby beliefs. In fact, I am completely convinced that the myth of Manga or Ma of Zoroastrian tradition is what is being alluded to in these depictions of bovines. In the myth, Ma, the moon, is in possession of the Sithra, or the Sithra. I don't really know how to say that word. I'll put it on screen. It's the seed, the progeny, or prototype of the primordial bull. In the tale, Je, the primordial whore, is convinced by Ahriman, who looks a lot like a lion-headed crucible being, to slay the primordial bovine. She does this, and the Sithri, the seed of the bull, is saved and placed into the protection of the moon, Ma. This seed, or progeny, is said to be the prototype of all creatures of the animal world. I believe the depiction of the tombstone in the river ruins is that of the moon cradling saplings that the astrologers brought with them. In turn, I believe these saplings were watered with the blood and fed by the flesh within the stone coffins. These trees bore fruit. These fruit were Numen. After the original trees are raised, this process would be reproduced with the grandmother trees. Perhaps a saint is given the task of becoming the next progenitor tree, called the grandmother in the shaman village. This is why the great tree is formed, from the flesh and blood of Numen, and why the Erd tree becomes the shrine and prison of Marika. She is a grandmother tree made a god. I do believe these vessels carried the primordial life energy of Numen in the form of blood and flesh. This is the primordial life which becomes the blessing of the Erd tree later during Marika's reign. I believe the Numen came to the lands between by the guidance of the moon, who is the protector of the Sithra, the seed, and by extension the protector of Numen in the lands between. The Numen would become the charges of the moon, their silent watcher. Now, whether the moon is benevolent or not, I think that's for each player to decide, but I do believe it has always watched over the Numen and those of Numen descent, and perhaps the moon is sympathetic in spirit, just like the great old ones. The connection to Ma is not the only connection between the moon and bulls of the myth of our own world and mythology, especially in this area around Mesopotamia. There is also the lunar god Min, who was likely inspired by Ma and was worshipped in parts of Anatolia. This lunar deity was accompanied by bulls and lions. I also believe the moon of Elden Ring is connected to the Mesopotamian god Sin, but I have honestly stayed on this topic for too long, so we're gonna move on. My point is, bulls and moons are heavily associated in the cultures used as reference in the ruins of the Knowledge Bearer, and I think that the connection of the bovines is important. Now, all this talk of cows and moons, the coming of astrologers, and the birth of Numen in the lands between is to say, I believe the first astrologers of the lands between were Numen. They came to the lands between aboard stone coffin vessels containing the very flesh and blood they could use to water and feed the trees that would bear the fruit that is their people. When they arrived, they brought with them the worship of the guiding moon, and the trees which were their mothers and grandmothers, and the wisdom of the stars. What is held in the knowledge bearer's arms is a representation of their cultural beliefs. In the beginning, the moon, the stars, and the trees all had an important place in ancient Numen society. Faith and astrology were intertwined. It was only later that the worship would become divided. It was only later that the greater will, or meteor, would exert influence on the Numen Marika. For meteor was perhaps not as passive as the watchful moon. Over time, many offshoots of the Numen culture would emerge. The shamans of the hinterlands, the astrologers of the mountaintops, perhaps even the giant-hating Zamor, and of course, the Nox of the eternal cities. I believe the Nox are the people from whom the Carians descended, and I believe the Nox are offshoots of Numen astrologers. As we can see in the games, the Nox cities are located near ruins that contain the statues of the Knowledge Bearer. After arriving in the lands between, the Numen people probably intermingled with local cultures, built cities, and after centuries, new civilizations would be built on top of old, as is the way with our own world. I mean, just look at Rome, the eternal city. Thus, the Nox, descendants of Numen astrologers, would come to build their cities upon the ruins of the old astrologers. Thus, their city is eternal, and their culture would persist. Even in the time of our Tarnished, even after their banishment underground, the cities remain. We also know the Nox were worshippers of the moon and stars, their night sky being of great importance to them. So much so that when it was taken from them, it led to despair and eternal darkness. They also collected celestial dew, which I believe to be coalesced starlight. And what is the light of the moon? Is it not starlight? We can pick up a plethora of starlight shards at the moonlight altar. So I think it goes to say that moonlight is starlight. The celestial dew was created by the Nox and is also called a night tear. What do we know of tears in Elden Ring? Well, we know that the crystal tears are amber. And what is amber? Primordial life. And what is the amber of the stars? Residual life. This is all important because I believe the celestial dew is what gave rise to the Nox culture. You see, I think a group of Numen astrologers in the ancient ruins created the first night folk, said to have bled silver long ago. I believe they were not yet attempting to make a Lord of Night. I think this would happen later with the rise of America, the Golden Order, and the banishment of the Nox underground. So how did they create the first night folk? Well, I believe it was through the use of celestial dew and what is in present day putrescent flesh from the stone coffins. When the Numen astrologers built their cities, which would become the ruins of the Knowledge Bearer, much time had passed since the initial Numen arrival. Enough time for Numen to split off into different cultures and clans. I think it would not be such a stretch to think that the flesh within the coffins would begin to fester, or even what it was made of would be considered tainted now. I mean, it does have snakes all over the coffins, so who knows? Whatever the case, the Numen astrologers cleansed the flesh, washed it free of its taint, using celestial dew. Remember, the flesh of the Numen is malleable. So too would be the flesh from inside the coffins. And this flesh was able to meld well with other things, be it trees, be it other flesh, be it starlight drafts. In this way, the tears, the silver tears of the eternal cities would be made, using this flesh and this cleansing ritual, which would meld that flesh with the celestial dew, creating our silver tears. And perhaps that is why their name is silver tears, their color and the tears from which they were born, the night tears. We know silver tears can take the form of people and have wills of their own. The spirit takes the form of the summoner to fight alongside them, but its mimicry does not extend to imitating the summoner's will. Now the silver tears were not quite flesh, not quite living, not quite unliving, something between, having properties of the residual life, that celestial amber, the glintstone, and the stars from which they were born. It is likely to me that the silver tears of this era were much different than the ones we see in the eternal cities today. I believe that the current tears of the eternal cities were created later using similar methods, but without access to the primordial flesh of the stone coffins. These silver tears are now even more artificial than those in the past. However, I think this first generation of silver tears was accepted as people within the Numen culture. They had minds and wills of their own, and their own creation would honestly not be that different from the tree-born Numen. they would be born from the same flesh. These silver tears would eventually become called the Night Folk, and would intermingle and produce children with the Numen. Eventually, this collective would build the eternal cities. This intermingling of Numen and silver tears would produce children who were able to give birth and bleed red instead of silver. The Night Folk no longer bleed silver after all. Eventually, their collective culture would become known as the Nox, for their adherence to the moon and the study of the night sky. I think it is from the Nox Eternal Cities that the Carian family descends. We can see evidence of this in the presence of the Urumi in Caria Manor. This weapon, made of extremely thin, flexible blades of metal, is wielded like a whip by Nightfolk warriors. I also think it is shown in their worship of the moon, and the presence of the astrologer woman who would become queen, Ranala. It is also seen in the glintstone kris we receive from sorceress Selin, ritual blade once presented to Lane Dell by the Academy of Ray Lucaria. The undulating blade is symbolic of an ancient ritual. This ancient ritual is that of the cleansing of oneself of sin by washing in the celestial dew. That same cleansing ritual that Radigan partook in, and also the same ritual that I believe helped birth the silver tears long ago. I think this evidence inextricably links the House of Caria with the Nightfolk, who are the Nox. I believe the Carians were of a people known as Moonfolk for their worship of the moon. They were likely a subset of the Nox culture that lived in the Moonfolk ruins. I believe this because it is here that Ranala, her sister, and eventually Rani would meet these moons. It is likely here that the House of Caria resided before they were chosen by the moon and became royalty. What is some evidence that links Carians to Numen heritage? Well, we must once again look to our own history. In reality, Carians were those that lived in Caria. Caria is located in southwest Anatolia, which, you may already know, neighbors ancient Mesopotamia, and is also the same Anatolia where the lunar god Min was worshipped. I think Caria, being a group of people of the same stock as the Numen, is not incredibly far-fetched, especially given that the Numen Black Knife assassins were from the Eternal Cities.
You recall our conversation about the Night of the Black Knives, yes? They say the assassins who carried out the deed were scions of the Eternal City, a group entirely of women, arrayed in armor of silver under cloaks which fooled the eye.
Another link to the ancient astrologers, who I believe to be Numen, and the Nox, would be the Belfries. The Belfries in Elden Ring each hold a portal to another place. Portals that appear too in the Eternal Cities and the ruins of the Knowledge Bearer. The Belfries are always found guarded by headless troll knights who are in service of the Carian royal family. Furthermore, on the Belfries themselves is the image of a man sprouting from roots or a tree, and he looks an awful lot like our Knowledge Bearer. I'm not sure if this is the same guy, but to me, he certainly looks similar. And I think it's no coincidence this man is also associated with roots, the roots of the Numen, ancient astrologers. Now, I believe the Moonfolk and House Caria broke off from the Eternal Cities prior to the fall of the cities. The tale of this fall I have a lot of thoughts on, but I will explain my thoughts in short today. Perhaps I will expound on them later, but it's too long for today. My interpretation is that when the fall occurred, the black moon of Noxtella was banished or sealed inside the full moon, and this was due to the influence of the greater will or meteor. See, I believe it was the Dark Moon, or the Black Moon, that first guided the Eternal Cities to attempt slaying the false god Meteor, which failed. This attempt led to the fall and banishment of the Eternal Cities. It is also why the moons are nestled into one another. When the Carian sisters Renala and R'hllana met the moons, the Dark Moon is sealed inside the full moon. But I think the moons together are attempting to wrest control back from the Greater Will, from Meteor and the Fingers, through the Carian nobles who, being Numen, have a special connection to the moon. I believe that prior to the fall of the Eternal Cities and prior to Renala becoming queen, the moonfolk astrologers were a simple people and lived in a small village outside the temple of Mana Celeste. They were not seen as a threat, being such a simple people, but the moon had other plans for the Carians, and the rest, I believe, is Elden Ring. So that's it. That's my theory. I hope you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole with me. I'm completely aware of how tenuous my theory is, but I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments below. And please let me know if you agree with me a little bit, not at all. Whatever you believe, I honestly would really love to hear your own theories, and honestly, I'd love to hear your most insane theories about Elden Ring. So please share them, and thank you for watching the video.